I'd like to welcome everybody to this afternoon's event. My name is James Robson. I'm the Victor and William Fung Director of the Harvard Asia Center. And like to welcome everybody to this afternoon's discussion focused on assessing the first year marking the coup in Myanmar that occurred on January 31st, February 1st of 2021, which led to the army's seizure of power. At that time, Myanmar's military, the Tatmadaw, said that it had taken control of the country and declared a state of emergency for a year after detaining the civilian leader Aung San Suu Kyi and other leaders of the ruling National League for Democracy, the NLD, in a pre-dawn operation. This was a coup staged against a democratically elected government. And we also held a panel earlier in 2020 on November 18th that included some of the speakers today, which assessed the elections that had taken place. And then exactly a year ago, on February 9th of 2021, this esteemed panel had gathered 1 week after the coup to assess what was happening at that time and what was known. So the response began with widespread nonviolent demonstrations, but then armed resistance grew after those protests were met with lethal force. Some now speak of the situation as amounting to, or at least becoming, a civil war with intensifications of violence leading to about 1,500 civilians killed so far, with a disproportionate amount of violence inflicted on women and girls. The insurgency continues, and there have been ongoing silent strikes and other demonstrations that continue to be met with military force, including airstrikes and the torching of villages. All the while, there have also been widespread arrests of civilians. Now, the economy of Myanmar is in dire straits. The healthcare system is being challenged and stretched, especially under the COVID situation, and humanitarian aid is desperately needed. So it's really my honor, I guess. I was going to say pleasure, but under these circumstances, it's not quite that appropriate word, I don't think, here, to bring together this esteemed panelists and to be equally saddened by the circumstances under which we have to gather again 1 year later. But we do really appreciate you taking the time to speak with us and share your expertise and knowledge about what is happening currently in the situation 1 year from the coup. So I'll introduce all of our speakers who will give some opening comments for about 10 to 15 minutes each. Then there will be some discussion among the panelists and then time for Q&A from the audience. If you intend to ask a question, you can do this at any time, and please just use the Q&A function down at the bottom of the Zoom window. So our first speaker is Weiwei Nu, who is the founder and executive director of the Women's Peace Network in Burma, and she has also founded Justice for Women and the Yangon Youth Leadership Center. She spent 7 years as a political prisoner in Burma, and she was also a genocide prevention fellow at the Simon Scott Center for the Prevention of Genocide at the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum in Washington, D.C. And she's also regularly issues the very important Women's Peace Network newsletter. The second speaker will be the Honorable Tom Andrews, who is the Special Rapporteur on the situation of human rights in Myanmar. He is a former member of the US Congress from Maine, and Tom Andrews is a Robina Senior Human Rights Fellow at Yale University Law School and also an associate of the Harvard Asia Center. The third speaker will be Matthew Smith. He is the co-founder and chief executive officer of Fortify Rights, a human rights organization based in Southeast Asia that supports human rights defenders and investigates human rights violations. He's also a Carr Center Fellow at the Carr Center for Human Rights Policy at Harvard University. Finally, the last speaker will be Tyler Giannini, who is a clinical professor of law and the co-director of Harvard Law School's Human Rights Program and the International Human Rights Clinic, and has extensive experience working in Myanmar. So again, thank you all for taking the time today. And in the interest of time, we'll turn things directly over to you, Weiwei. Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much, Professor. And thank you for having me in this important panel with our esteemed guests and speakers. It is actually very sad that we are here today and talking about the same thing, and we weren't able to end suffering of Myanmar people. Again, once again, we're here after 1 year. For me, to reflect on 1 year coup, as I wrote last week in Foreign Policy op-ed, the international community has actually wasted 1 year and left Myanmar people, especially many young people in Myanmar, with no options but to take arms. And now we are in a full-blown civil war. It is also quite incredible to see that the Myanmar military is still unable to control the country, the territories of the country, as well as how the movement, the pro-democracy movement, have been able to kind of distract the entire systems, including economy and many other fronts. I think it is very, very important to give credit to the pro-democracy movement and the spirit and the resilience of the Burmese people. As you know, Burma is Burma is a developing country, and a lot of people actually depend on daily income. And now, even given with that background, the people are still remain strong and resilient to fight against the military dictatorship. As a result, the military is unable to control the country and the systems, which is quite incredible. And I think we have to really, really give credit and acknowledgement to the people of Myanmar and their spirits. And you can actually see how that also reflected the desire of the people to wanting to live in free society, to live in peaceful society, and to their urge for democracy and freedom. However, the military's responses, this disproportionate response and indiscriminate killings and mass arrest of the populations has led to the situations on the ground for the people of Myanmar as a tragedy. As you mentioned, over 1 year, in 1 year, the military has actually murdered over 1,500 people and arbitrarily arrested and detained over 12,000 people, and tortured to death at least 182 people actually has been tortured to death. A lot of the time, those detainees were, even if they're not tortured to death, they are severely tortured and left with really serious injuries and mental to physical harms. The way that the military has been treating the detainees has been very cruel. It's something that is not new for as as someone from the Rohingya community, but it is new for a lot of Burmese people. Now Burmese people understand came to realize how this military can be cruel against anyone, regardless of their religion or ethnicity. And again, not only that, after the a rise of People Defense Force, the military has been actually using the launching airstrikes and perpetrating related attacks on areas primarily inhabited by the country's ethnic minority communities, such as Chin State, Karenni State, and Shan State, as well as Sagaing and Magway. This systematic and widespread attacks of violence has destroyed hundreds of thousands of civilians' properties, including schools, churches, and forced over 200,000 civilians to flee their homes. a lot of them are women and children and facing so many hardship in the border. As my organization's Women's Peace Network reported in its briefer last week on February 1st, junta is also committing the most brutal form of sexual and gender-based and girls and continuously using rape as weapons of war across the country and countries growing areas of armed conflict. Just to give two examples, in mid-November, Chin State in Tiddim Township, junta soldiers raped and gang raped 2 women, including a pregnant woman. And given the survivors of tortures and sexual violence ashamed and humiliations from being subjected to such brutality and the pain and suffering of many more women and girls in Myanmar may have yet to be reported. There are some cases that we've been able to report or make it public. There are a lot of cases that we've been hearing that we aren't able to make it public due to the reprisal and repercussions. So just to go back to the movement, the pro-democracy movement, as I mentioned in my op-ed, despite of all of these brutalities and attacks by the Myanmar junta, the military, I think this is quite incredible for me to see how the ethnic communities and democracy activists and Burma political activists and politicians comes together, form national unity government, and continue to make the organizations or the movement better through national unity consultative body or many other coordinations among the different communities. Although there are a huge need for the Rohingya community to be meaningfully engaged, but I see this as a positive step towards a future we want to build. And this sort of unity and solidarity and unity is quite unique in Burma's history. And I think many of us, from people from different communities, including the ethnic Burma majority, understand that they cannot fight alone, and we have to really work together, come together to be strong to fight against this cruel military. That I see as a really positive step, and we need to continue work on building from that base. Despite of all of these situations, the military coup has actually brought the Rohingya a disaster in many, many ways. Not only that military continue to keep the 600,000 Rohingya populations in Rakhine State in apartheid-like condition, but also resumed many of the repressive policies against the Rohingya, where the prospect of repatriations is still it's very grim or unlikely under the military junta. I do believe that the vast majority of the Rohingya will be extremely reluctant to return to the place where the perpetrators, the perpetrators of genocide and people who killed their families and their relatives. I don't think that they will be able to. They will be able to come back, or they would want to come back to in a scenario, in a situations. So I think the prospect of it is completely unsafe as well, and I think the prospect of repatriations is very, very low. So that is very crucial and important for us to recognize, and also put that into consideration to really end the military dictatorship as soon as possible and hold the military leaders accountable. That being said, going back to the Rakhine State, yes, they have resumed all the repressive policies, including family check-in, family check-in process, which we call as the periodic family check-in process, which is the most humiliating process of all among the treatment of Rohingya and all of these years, as well as the restrictions on the travel and movement of Rohingya has been practiced in a more severe forms. Since the February 1st coup, my organization has documented at least 651 people have been arrested, and majority of them were sentenced to 2 to 3 years. That detainees include very young children to elderly, and majority of the people, the Rohingya who have been arrested for traveling from Rakhine State to outside of Rakhine State, majority of them are actually women, and recently, we've been informed by the local communities in Maungdaw and Butidong that the military has been using the Rohingya as a human shield. Yesterday, actually, at 11 p.m., a young man, a driver, was used for their raid, and when AA attacked them, these young men was killed. So it seems like military will be continuously using Rohingya as a human shield in their operations with the war with us, Arkan army. There are many more other developments, including increasing hate speech and propaganda by the military against the Rohingya and Muslims in general. And I think that there is a huge risk of the military has been actually over the past year, they have tried many times to actually create a communal kind of tensions by diverting the public opinion from the coup to the anti-Muslim hate campaign, but they haven't been able to successfully shift the public opinion yet, since people are very aware of the military's behavior at this point. So it is not easy, but there is still a huge risk that they may shift to at some point the communal tensions and violence, as we had in 2012 and after since then. Therefore, I think the military coup is a disaster for not only a disaster for Rohingyas specifically, and the disaster and tragic for entire country now. And Rohingya are at a great and unique risk of mass atrocity, recurrence of mass atrocity crimes amid ongoing genocide. So I guess I will end here, and I will be really happy to receive any questions you may have and provide more thoughts during the Q&A.
Thank you very much, Wei Wei. Yes, well, there's a number of questions we'll definitely get back to. So thank you for that update and report. So next we'll turn to Tom Andrews.
Thank you, James. Wei Wei and fellow members of this very distinguished panel. It is a pleasure to be back with all of you 1 year later, but it's of course not a pleasure at all to be talking about what we'll be talking about today, and the review what Wei Wei, the very sobering, horrific statistics and facts that Wei Wei has described to us. What I think we're seeing in Myanmar is the very best and the very worst of humanity. the worst we're seeing at the hands of the military junta that attempted this coup just about a year ago today. Where we mentioned the 1,500 people who have been killed by the military junta. 100 of them have been are children. At least 100 are children. She talked about those who have been arbitrarily detained, thousands and thousands of people arbitrarily detained. But what is so horrific about this particular junta and the terror that it continues to unleash on the people of Myanmar is this, that if they cannot find someone who is arrested or they want to arrest, wanted for arrest, they go after their family, including very young children. I've had the great honor of meeting with many, many people who have had the courage to talk to me remotely from various parts of Myanmar. And they've described this experience of having family members, mothers, fathers, sisters, brothers, very young children, abducted by the military and put into prison so that they can pressure those who are wanted for arrest to come forward and give themselves up. We've seen houses being property being confiscated, and houses, in fact, entire villages being torched by this military. It is absolutely horrific what is happening day in and day out in Myanmar. And I can tell you that these assaults and this terror continues unabated. I continue to hear reports right up until very, very recently of this kind of behavior, this terror, this murder, this torture, these abductions, including of young families, at the hands of the military. And what the military has, it's a criminal enterprise. It is acting like a criminal gang, and it is taking whatever resources it can get access to, including revenue coming into Myanmar, and it's using it to buy very sophisticated weaponry to continue these attacks against its own people. Now most militaries, when we think of a military, we think, well, they're there to protect a population. Well, the Myanmar military does precisely the opposite. It takes very sophisticated weapons of war and it unleashes them against the population. And I'm talking about airstrikes. I'm talking about artillery fire. I'm talking about very sophisticated weaponry being used to murder innocent people. Just last week, I was talking to a man. It was incredible, the courage that he exhibited to meet and speak with me. A friend of his was holding his phone so that we could connect. And he described to me what had happened to his village. And he said that he had lost just a few days prior to our conversation, his two daughters, 12 and 15 years of age. They were killed when a bomb was dropped on their village. They died in their sleep. And as a dad, it's impossible to imagine the absolute agony and horror, the living nightmare that is life for millions of people throughout Myanmar. If they have not been assaulted or attacked or abducted, or have a family member assaulted, attacked, or abducted, then they live in terror that they will be next, their village will be next. And that is exactly the strategy and the tactics of this military junta. Now, as Weiwei mentioned, we're also seeing here the very best of humanity unfolding before our very eyes. And I'm talking about the courage, the tenacity, the creativity of those who are standing up to oppose and to fight against this scourge of the military and to save their families, their villages, their country, and their children and grandchildren. It is absolutely awe-inspiring to me to have the honor and privilege of having a chance to speak with them and learn from them how the people of Myanmar continue to defy and rise up. We saw a citizens movement, a civil disobedience movement rise up. Now remember, a year ago, there were millions of people on the streets all over the country. And then the military leadership announced on state TV that if you go out and participate in these massive demonstrations, then you could be killed. You could be shot, and they were very specific. You could be shot in the head. And sure enough, 24 hours later after that broadcast, people began to be murdered by sharpshooters striking people in these demonstrations in the head. So the organizers and leaders of this opposition movement adapted a range of tactics that could continue to build pressure on the junta and oppose what they are trying to do to their country. So we saw the civil disobedience would be launched, and it is still very, very vibrant. We saw flash demonstrations around the country that continue. We saw what I've described as citizen sanctions, in which citizens refuse to buy anything that's associated with the military junta. I was speaking to a shop owner just the other day who refuses to sell anything that is in any way connected to the junta. They are withholding their taxes. They are refusing to pay their energy bills to the junta. And already it's now being projected that just these measures alone have cost the junta over $1 billion. So the opposition continues, and we saw just last week the silent strike, streets abandoned all over the country, despite the efforts of the junta to threaten and intimidate people not to participate in that silent strike. What the people of Myanmar need from us is our support. The future and the fate of Myanmar is in their hands, but they need the international community to be successful. Now, there are three things that the junta needs. They need money, they need weapons, and they need legitimacy. We can deny them the money that they need by tightening and expanding and deepening the economic sanctions that have been launched by various countries in various parts of the world, targeting those areas of the junta in which they are most vulnerable. And what I believe is necessary. Now, of course, the Security Council of the United Nations, it would be perfect if they would convene and establish sanctions across the board. They're not going to do that, but in the absence of that kind of action, countries who are willing to stand with and for the people of Myanmar can coordinate their sanctions policy, target those areas that are most vulnerable on the part of the junta, and then coordinate and mobilize those sanctions. Why is this a vulnerability? Precisely because the military that the junta has at its disposal is quite large. And of course, they take great pride in this. They have enormous weapons at their disposal. But these weapons and this military takes a lot of money to sustain, to continue to operate, to continue to be housed and clothed and sent out on their missions. This is therefore a vulnerability. And if we as an international community can increase the sanctions that exist right now, I believe they could be increased significantly. Then we have an opportunity to stop them. Weapons, we need to have an international arms embargo. Again, the UN Security Council should convene this afternoon. There should be an emergency session, and there should be an arms embargo established by the Security Council. Back in June, the General Assembly established with an overwhelming vote, 119 countries supporting a call for the nations of the world to stop weapons from flowing into Myanmar. Only one country opposed this resolution. Not a single member of the Security Council opposed this resolution. But to date, there has not only not been decisive action taken by the Security Council, but not a single member of the Security Council has even been willing to put a resolution, a binding resolution, calling for an arms embargo before the Security Council for a vote and a debate and a vote and final action. Finally, legitimacy. The junta is doing everything that it can to create this mirage, this image of legitimacy among its population. When ASEAN established, had a summit back in April 24th, to confront this crisis, they established a consensus position, including Min Aung Hlaing agreeing to this consensus. And the first position of this 5-point consensus was that violence should stop. Min Aung Hlaing returned, the head of the junta returned to Myanmar, showed all the imagery of him with leaders of ASEAN, the red carpet on the tarmac, etc. And then said that, well, this consensus, these were really suggestions that had been made, and he would consider these suggestions as soon as he had stabilized the country and defeated his opponents. So he will do anything and everything that he can to try to create this image, this mirage of legitimacy, because it means a lot to him. Now, the UN General Assembly, to its credit, will not allow the junta to seat its representative before the General Assembly. And when ASEAN, at its last summit, refused to invite the leader of the junta, Min Aung Hlaing, he was just outraged. And within 24 hours, thousands of political prisoners were released. It matters. It makes a difference. And there are so many ways that the international community can continue to not lend legitimacy to the junta while recognizing as a vital partner the national unity government and work closely with them to forge the kind of international movement and support the domestic movement inside of Myanmar that can genuinely make a difference. One final point, and that is the international community needs to increase significantly the humanitarian aid and assistance that is being provided to the people of Myanmar. Over half the people of Myanmar are now or soon will be in poverty. There is a great humanitarian need. There's a great catastrophe unfolding before our very eyes. And it's vitally important that we do more to get aid into Myanmar, into the hands of those who desperately need it. And again, it's the national unity government that's a vital resource that we can work with in order to do that. So I'm sorry that we're meeting 1 year later to talk about this horror. I'm hopeful, James, that we can convene perhaps 1 year again from now and talk about how justice, human rights prevailed and the people of Myanmar were successful in ending this nightmare and building a future of hope and human rights and dignity for their people. So thank you for inviting me to join you once again this year.
Thank you very much, Tom. And in fact, even before we signed on, Matt and I were having a discussion saying, wouldn't it have been nice to have this been a year later when we were talking about strategies for building a long-term democratic processes in Myanmar. So that would be much more appropriate now. So thank you very much for those comments. I do think there will be some topics to come back to, both about domestic kind of unity and what's happening in country, but also some questions and further questions about what the international community might effectively do. So let's turn now to Matt Smith, and I'll turn the mic over to you, Matt. Thank you.
Thank you so much, James. Thank you, Tom, Wei, Tyler, and thanks everyone who's tuned into this event here today. I'd like to take the opportunity to touch on some recent research and documentation that we're currently working on at Fortify Rights, some of which is unpublished, but won't be for long. So since the coup at Fortify Rights, we've documented the military's this multifaceted attack on the civilian population that Tom and Wei have discussed. And by our estimation, it includes at least 2 distinct phases of atrocity crimes, both of which are related, both of which are ongoing. The first phase involved the deadly crackdown on peaceful protesters, which I think it is worth mentioning is ongoing. So that is to say, the Myanmar junta continues to kill civilians for exercising their rights to freedom of expression and peaceful assembly, and for engaging in nonviolent peaceful actions. In the initial months following the coup, people throughout the country took to the streets, as was mentioned, defying the military, defying the police, exercising their rights, demanding democracy and human rights and the release of political prisoners. This phase was especially intense, I would argue, in the initial 5 to 6 months following the coup. We've interviewed at this point, well over 100 survivors and eyewitnesses, protesters, medical professionals, members of armed resistances, former and active duty members of the military, police, and Navy, all located in more than 20 townships in 13 of the country's 14 states and regions. We've documented firsthand evidence of widespread and systematic murder, imprisonment, torture, enforced disappearances, forced population transfer by the Myanmar military and police. Much of the military junta's attack during this phase on peaceful protesters occurred in broad daylight. It was, in a way, broadcast to the world via social media. And so the fact that this attack on the civilian population was effectively streamed online, so to speak, of course, makes the world's inadequate response even more difficult to accept. As a related aside, during the Rohingya genocide in 2016 and 2017, which is also ongoing, as Weiwei elaborated on, when we were documenting massacres and other atrocities at that time against the Rohingya in Myanmar, a standard question that we received from governments, numerous governments, was, is there video footage? That question in some ways had to be asked, but it was the perceived lack of video evidence in an age of hyperconnectivity that stifled the world's response to the Rohingya genocide, or so we thought. How could there not be video footage of attacks on Rohingya? Some diplomats asked us, seemingly baffled by the very deliberate digital divide experienced by Rohingya people. So needless to say, the government of Myanmar had for a very long time rendered it illegal for Rohingya to own and possess phones, let alone smartphones. And Rohingya who were caught with phones were routinely detained, extorted, sometimes beaten or tortured. So this was a reality that was largely unknown to many people in Myanmar due to the military and the government's disinformation campaigns. So now fast forwarding to the junta's initial crackdown on peaceful protesters following the coup last year, and there's an abundance of video and photographic evidence that exists. In the initial months of the crackdown, people were uploading to social media, and still are, thousands of videos and photographs of the junta's atrocity crimes. Our team collected more than 1,100 meaningful data points of information about specific incidents of human rights violations collected from open source media. And this was by no means the extent of information available. So needless to say, we no longer received the previously routine question, was it filmed? The evidence is there for everyone to see. And nevertheless, the reaction from many governments does remain woefully inadequate, or we would argue in the case of China and Russia, complicit. In addition to documenting firsthand testimony and analyzing content uploaded to social media, we're also looking closely at the military's command structure, as well as other new information that we hope may be helpful for prosecutors. We've obtained some leaked military documents, including internal memos instructing forces to commit crimes, manuals for soldiers, as well as the confidential locations of military battalions nationwide. So as Tom and Weiwei and James suggested in the intro, these attacks, the coup leader, Senior General Min Aung Hlaing, and his forces have targeted people from all walks of life. So all ethnicities, all religions, women, men, old and young. The military's targets for murders and arrests include politicians and government officials, healthcare professionals, nonviolent protesters, filmmakers, workers, human rights defenders, poets, writers, celebrities, the list goes on and on. So this phase of the attack, that is the attack on peaceful protesters and anyone exercising their right to freedom of expression, and an inadequate response from the global community, as was suggested, in some ways directly led people to pick up arms. It led to the creation of scores of PDFs, or People's Defense Forces, which we define basically as community-based militias formed in self-defense to resist military rule. Many PDFs have formed relationships with the national unity government and existing non-state ethnic armies, of which there are, of course, dozens. The PDFs are growing in size and sophistication. They are increasingly exercising control over swaths of territory. And on that point, which is relevant for a number of reasons, but the Myanmar junta in no way is exercising effective control over the territory of Myanmar. And to state the obvious, it doesn't represent the sovereign will of the people of Myanmar. As Tom said, it's a criminal enterprise and it should be treated as such. So the second phase of the junta's attack, from our perspective on the civilian population, involves atrocity crimes committed against civilians in the context of armed conflict. And as it was suggested, much of these armed conflicts are taking place in Myanmar's ethnic states. One such place is Karenni State in eastern Myanmar. Back in November last year, we published a flash report detailing how the military forcibly displaced civilians in Karenni State and then blocked life-saving humanitarian aid to them. In that report, it's called Access Denied. We provide evidence on how the military arbitrarily arrested aid workers, destroyed food stocks, confiscated aid, and committed other acts that we believe constitute war crimes. Later this week, we're going to be publishing another flash report on the situation in Karenni State, which is dire. That report will include evidence of further mass atrocity crimes being committed by the military against civilians in the context of this armed conflict, with several non-state ethnic armies and PDFs who have effectively banded together in Karenni State. That report will release on Thursday this week. It will include evidence of how the military murdered civilians, forcibly displaced an enormous portion of the population of Karenni State, used human shields and destroyed non-military targets, including Christian churches and civilian residences. And there'll be some more information as well that we'll be making available with regard to the junta's attacks on civilians, particularly in December last year and January this year. During that time, the junta intensified its attack on civilians in Karenni State. We've documented firsthand testimony, video, and photographic evidence of the massacring of men, women, and children, bombing of civilian populated areas, the military's use of heavy artillery, arson, and airstrikes against civilian targets. Needless to say, the military junta is the only armed force in the country with an air force. So there's no question as to who is bombing whom in these particular cases. In terms of recommendations, as Tom discussed, we are also pressing for the UN Security Council to impose a global arms embargo that would prevent the sale of weapons and dual-use technology to the Myanmar military. We are pressing for the Security Council to refer the situation to the ICC and to impose targeted sanctions to deny the junta access to those revenues that it craves. Following the leadership of the people of Myanmar, as well as Tom and others, we're encouraging UN member states not to wait for UN Security Council action. With regard to Myanmar's neighbors in ASEAN, the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, none are significant suppliers of arms to the Myanmar military, yet ASEAN is consistently left to deal with the economic, political, and humanitarian after effects of the military's attacks on the civilian population. A global arms embargo against the military, we would argue, makes good sense for ASEAN. So we're recommending that ASEAN governments immediately signal support to the UN Security Council for a global arms embargo to prevent the sale of weapons or dual-use technology to the Myanmar military. Lastly, I just want to mention the revenues from the sale of natural gas remain the junta's single largest source of revenue, more than $1 billion annually. Those resources and revenues belong to the people of Myanmar, not the criminal regime that's attempting to rule over them. So we're pressing the US, the EU, and others to immediately sanction the Myanmar oil and gas enterprise and to take effective measures to interdict the gas revenues, put them in escrow until such a time as the people of Myanmar can enjoy a democracy. There are plenty of other recommendations and things that I think are in need of urgent attention, but I'll leave it there and look forward to the discussion. Thank you so much.
Wonderful. Thank you, Matt. Definitely a few questions to come back to there, particularly the issue of natural gas sales and some questions about the military, but I'll wait till we get to the discussion period. And I'll turn things over now to Tyler, please.
Thanks, James. And thanks to, it's always hard to go last, right? Matt and Wei Wei and Tom have covered the gamut of things. So what do I get to add here? And maybe I get to kind of draw some threads, and I think maybe a little bit more reflective on step back a little bit. I'm going to try and do that. But first, I'm going to actually start with the word coup. So a year ago, it's often talked about as the coup. But I think Tom said attempted coup. And I think that's actually the more accurate term, in part because of what Matt said. Matt said, it's not the sovereign will. They don't have effective control of the country. And I think that's one of the remarkable things looking back at the past year, is that it has not gone from an attempt to take over into actually taking over. And so I think what I'd like to kind of focus on is what makes this a remarkable year. And I think there's a couple of things that make it a remarkable year. One is the mass atrocities, of course, and the human toll. But there's a series of other things that I think have happened over the last year that really make this kind of a generational moment. It's not like there have been military violence in the country for decades, but I think this past year marks a change potentially that's going to usher in the foundations of something that can lead to change eventually for the people of Burma. And I think that's what I want to reflect on. So just a little bit on the human tolls. I'm director of a human rights clinic. What we've heard today, basically, if you go down the list of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, you get every abuse in the list is taking place in the country. I'm not going to go through all of those. I think they've been covered. If you look at the three international crimes, genocide, war crimes, crimes against humanity, which is widespread and systematic attacks on civilians, they're all present in Burma. And so this is the worst of the worst when it comes to the human toll. We've heard that. I'm not going to rehash that. That is one of the remarkably parts of the past year, is to see that play out. But I think Matt and Wei Wei and Tom have covered that piece of it. To me, there's a couple other things, though, that mark this as kind of a new era. And the first, I think, is the civilian disobedience movement that's been mentioned. But that's a once in a generation thing. There have been between 1988, that was the last big one where you had this level of people in the streets. You had other movements in 2007, the Saffron Revolution, some other markers. But this is a massive movement that does not happen really since 1988. So that's one marker. And I think that's part of that generational shift. The second piece is that I think that actually led to the creation of the National Unity Government. That really the people in the street were celebrating the diversity of Burma. The people of Burma were speaking about the bridge between Burman populations and ethnic nationalities. And they said they wanted that. There was also learning going on during those movements. It's not that everyone who's in the streets knows about the experience of the Rohingya, for example. So there's a lot more learning to be done, but there's definitely a shift there. And so what you get the elected officials, mostly from the National League for Democracy, joining with ethnic nationalities to create the first national unity. And that's, to stress that word, unity government. It's not all the way there, of course, but it is a marker of something different from before. That's the second thing I think that the last year has really played out that way. I think you also see a generational shift. The NLD is filled with an executive committee that's mostly elders, and you're getting a new generation of leadership as well. And that's important to note because that life experience is different. And I think that hopefully will bode well for Burma in the future. I think another marker is that, of course, there's not the rule of law, but the last 10 years has been defined by the 2008 Constitution. And I think we can safely say that the 2008 Constitution is now no longer in place. It's effectively dead. And so whatever is going to come in the future is going to be different and hopefully better than what the people of Burma want. There's some processes there, maybe we can talk about that. The next piece, I think, that marks, there have been kind of stalled attempts to have a peace process. That's also gone, as we're talking about conflict, right? And so there needs to be a big push on the peace side of things eventually, so that you can then have peace and accountability, which is my next thing. There have been remarkable developments on the accountability side. The fact that the NUG, the National Unity Government, has put in to the International Criminal Court that it wants to have jurisdiction. This is a remarkable development of the last year on the accountability side. And if that representation takes over the country eventually, they've made a commitment to international accountability at the government level. That's a big shift. You also have the similar international level of, as Tom noted, the junta's representatives at the UN have not been recognized. In the past, they were, but they do not want the representatives who are at the UN to be their representatives, but the UN has not accepted the junta's recognition. So not full recognition to the NUG yet, but certainly not the legitimacy that the junta needs to get. And that's a remarkable development. And I think you're also seeing ASEAN keep its options open. So while there needs to be the kind of sanctions on arms embargo and more international action, you're getting markers that there's going to be something different about just blindly recognizing the junta. That's a remarkable development over the last year. The last one I would close on is kind of the gas and businesses exiting. And some people have been pushing for the exiting of companies for decades. And now you're seeing some more of that than in the past. Again, not all the way there, but I think there's some markers here that this last year is different. And the question then becomes, what's going to be the recipe for making sure that you can finally put an end to 7 decades of military disruption? That's the question. And I think we have the marker from the people of Burma. The CDM gives us the moral blueprint of what they want. They want to be able to exercise their rights. They want diversity. Hopefully the unity part of the NUG gets stressed. That's the second part. Can that be transferred over? Can those visions, the two visions of unity and diversity, draw people out of the military and over to the other side? Do you have more desertions recently? Can that continue? Can there be cracks in the military? And I think in order to have good cracks in the military, you have to have the vision. But the people of Burma have basically laid that out. So hopefully there'll be more power building on the side of the people of Burma than the military has in the long run, despite the mass atrocities that have been talked about. And the last piece is international. And I think here the question is really, for me, the arms embargo is part of it, but I also think it's about resourcing the resiliency of what the NUG and the CDM really represent. They need the humanitarian assistance so they can have resiliency. They need the support so that they can stay at it, because ultimately this has to be the people of Burma getting their ability to exercise their rights. So it isn't just the arms embargo side, it's also about putting resources on the other side that isn't just humanitarian, but it's political, and it's about giving the rightful elected people and also the masses of people the ability to speak and have that infrastructure that they need to withstand this, but eventually then rule the country the way they should be and the way that they have signaled they want to. So on that note, I will, I'll hand it back to you, James, to handle some questions. But to me, it's been actually a remarkable year.
Great. Thank you very much, Tyler. And I think we can bring everybody back together now for a period where we can discuss some of this. So we have about 30 minutes, which is great, actually, because I think some of the nuances and issues that all of you have raised will be important to consider. So I thought it might be good just to begin perhaps with to see if any of you have responses to comments that the other panelists have made, either just in elaboration or responding to those perspectives that have been offered. And then we'll move on to questions from the audience. And I also have a couple of my own that I'd be interested in hearing about. So I'll first give you all the opportunity to see if you have any responses to each other's comments. Though I think it sounded like there was people were, covering, in terms of the atrocities and everything. It's just a very long list that has been very clear. But I think there's some other points that might be of interest to consider. So, anybody like to begin?
Maybe I could just, particularly on the point that Tyler just made, and Matt and Wei also referred to, and that is there is a vital civil society in place in Myanmar. It's remarkable what they are doing, the organizing, the opposition, the human rights advocacy, the kind of research that's being done on the ground, and the combination of INGOs working with and supporting civil society inside of the country is truly remarkable. And as I mentioned before, are inspiring. And I think Tyler's exactly right. This is the kind of investment that we need to be making in helping that infrastructure, those human rights workers, humanitarian workers, those that are on the front lines of confronting this crisis and organizing and mobilizing people inside of the country to confront it from inside. It's extremely important. I want to just associate myself with their comments. It's a very, very important investment that we can and should be making as an international community.
Great. Anybody else?
I have a question for others, which is actually about one of my fears is maintaining visibility. That as the mass demonstrations of the first half of the year, as Matt said, has kind of moved into more rural areas, one of my concerns is that it's less visible. And so I'm wondering about keeping it on the radar so that you can get that investment and get the arms embargo done. I'm wondering how people are feeling about that. You have the same concerns or maybe solutions to that one.
So I would also like to echo the point raised by Tyler, and Matt has also mentioned previously the situations, the visibility and information's difficulties of obtaining informations and recordings in Rakhine State. I think that is happening in many parts of Myanmar today, in Karenni State, in remote part of Chin State, as well as in Sagaing, where people are so poor and they don't have access to technology, mobile phones, and internet. The junta has recently actually increased internet data prices. So it's become extremely difficult for the people to record and to upload timely manner. So it's very concerning situations that I think we have to pay attention to. And also it's not just about the technology, but also resources wise. A lot of people from Karenni State are seeking for help, but they are not actually getting any support, humanitarian aids to other resources that they need, including for PDFs in that region. They don't have enough equipment and weapons or that they need to protect themselves. So the scarcity of resources is a huge problem for many part of the remote part of Myanmar where the conflict are escalating these days. And I think it is crucial that there is way to provide assistance to those areas, including the humanitarian aid. And that can be done through through reaching out to the local civil society organizations, development organizations, and creating a channel or access resources, channeling the resources in non-formal way, not requiring a lot of bureaucratic processes and documentations. I think making resources available through an easy channel will be crucial at this point for people to be able to remain strong and resilient, as well as to save lives. I think that's crucial. I know that a lot of the international organizations functions in a very difficult, complex bureaucratic processes. So that has to ease. And diversifications of the resources is also essential, not just relying on a few different groups, but basically spreading out the distributions of resources is crucial. And last point around, I think, overall, we discuss about all of the situations and dynamic and remarkable things that had happened. But again, once again, if I bring back to the core, I think it is essential for the international community at this point to put extra effort to end military's impunity, to hold the military leaders accountable for ongoing and past crimes. Unless we do that, the military will not step back. And they are not going to, the quiet diplomacy will not be working anymore. And the international community has already seen it for 1 year of, the quiet diplomacy through ASEAN's or different means. And it will not work. And if we wait for 1 more year, we will be seeing more mass atrocities in Myanmar, prolonging the conflict and losing unnecessary lives. So I think there has to be a notion and a realization that the accountability is essential and taken serious as it is. If not, we're going to be just prolonging the conflict and seeing continuations of mass atrocities committed by the military. And as you all pointed out, the Myanmar military has been committing all 3 core international crimes, gross crimes. And why, there is not enough effort to really end this mass atrocities and the crimes committed by the military. I think this question should be crucial, and we need to really, really push in every opportunities and every venue we have. Otherwise, there will be delays and there will be more losses of lives. Thanks.
Just a quick point. Thanks for that, Wei. Just a quick point on Tyler's question on visibility. We're concerned about it too, and we at Fortify Rights, we collect a lot of data about our work. We want to know what works. We want to know where we need to tweak things, where we can improve. And one area where we've collected data relates to a correlation between visibility and access to people in power. So in other words, the more visible the work that our team is doing is, the more access our team has to people in power. And so I think, learning from that and building off of the point that was made about the importance of Myanmar's human rights defenders and Myanmar's CSOs, the more support that they have, the more able they will be able, they'll be able to do their work, the work that they need to be doing. There'll be more visibility. So I think there are some connections here to make in terms of providing the support that human rights defenders need in order to address this issue of visibility, to prevent these atrocities from waning from the attention of not only the general public, but policymakers and people in positions of power.
Let me just also add one
Please.
thing, a very important question on visibility. You know, the media is fickle. We know that there'll be great droughts of broad-based visibility. The key, I think, is for those of us who are paying close attention, that the audience that is going to be very, very important in all of these cases are those of policymakers and decision makers. So getting the word to members of Congress, for example, that this does matter, that atrocities do continue, that the United States has to take stronger steps. I mean, those are the audiences of coverage that are extremely important. And then from my point of view, I'm the special rapporteur on the situation of human rights in Myanmar, and I'm racking my brain. How can I increase the knowledge and the awareness of the world on these atrocities? So in addition to my regular reports to the Human Rights Council and my annual reports to the General Assembly, I decided to begin to issue a series of special reports that conference papers is what they're called. And in a very short while, I'll be launching a report on the flow of weapons into Myanmar. Who's behind it? Why? Who's taking action about it, and what can be done about it? I'm also going to be in the not too distant future focusing on sanctions, economic sanctions, what can be done, how can we increase them, and then trying to mobilize as much as possible media attention that will get these messages and this information into the right hands, to the right audiences that will be able to make a difference.
Great, thank you all. Thanks, Tom. And so I'm going to try to weave together a couple of questions that are starting to appear from the audience, but also a few things that I had started to frame in my own mind with some questions here. So one of the things I was hoping to hear from you all on is that in a previous panel that we did, we had Motuzar as one of the speakers, and I noticed that recently she had published something about the, we're all aware now, and we've heard a lot about it today, about the atrocities of the military, but also that there might be some signs of lack of morale, the military, some kind of weaknesses forming, perhaps more deserters, perhaps even in some areas being outmatched by the civil protesters and opposition. And I'm just curious if you had any thoughts about that, and is that a sign that things might be changing? The flip side of the question is obviously what will replace that. And I think all of you have mentioned, the role of the NUG, the National Unity Government here. But it also seems to have its own kind of lack of unity in some ways right now. So what are some steps that could be taken for the National Unity Government to build its own profile, cohesion, and even perhaps are there ways and what might be taken from the international community to recognize the NUG, what's getting in the way of that? So those are sort of looking at two sides of the balances of what's going on here, and don't know if any of you would have any comments on that.
Well, just a quick. Oh, sorry. Go ahead, Tom. Oh. Just a quick point. I think in terms of the NUG, we've had some specific recommendations for the NUG, and we've been engaging with ministers of the NUG and others. I would say that if recognition by governments is measured by engagement, a number of diplomats that we've spoken with have informed us they've had a total of 0 meetings with members of the Myanmar junta, and comparing that with dozens of meetings they've had with the acting president and other senior ministers of the NUG. So in that sense, there does seem to be at least some international recognition of the National Unity Government and of the sovereign will of the people of Myanmar. And I think that, of course, we'd like to see more of that, and we'll be advocating for more of that. But there are some, there is a bit of hope, I think, in that engagement that is taking place.
Tom, did you have something as well?
With respect to weakness within the military, deserters, etc. I'm trying to find hard numbers. I know that there have been desertions from various pockets around the country. So we're trying to determine what kind of numbers those reflect. But I have spoken to deserters, interviewed them to get a sense of what's going on in those barracks and what the morale situation is within the military. And I can tell you it is low. And again, the fear that we see outside the military community in Myanmar, there's a lot of fear being generated inside the military community. There's a gun at your back. And so you have your family, and you have your home and your village, and the junta, as I speak to people, they make it very clear that you will pay a very heavy price for desertion. But nonetheless, it is happening. It is happening. And we also know that there's been a drop in the numbers of people going into the applying for the military academy. It used to be very competitive to get in, very prestigious thing for families. Those numbers are dropping.
Great, thanks, Tom. So let me shift to a slightly different question. Well, I guess one of the questions then is, many of you brought up the topic of sanctions here, and this can happen on many different levels, and I'm not sure all the different things that might be considered in this regard. We've seen some, and also many of you mentioned putting pressure on international companies and things like that. So we've seen recently with Chevron and Total Energies pulling out and of Myanmar as well. But is there a way, do you think, to balance the desire to impose stricter sanctions without impacting the people of Myanmar adversely as well? In other words, it sounded like you were primarily referring to weapons and things like that, but is there a danger of also just compounding any problems with the non-military population and the opposition?
Maybe I can start this one. I would say that the sanctions piece of this, first thing that came to mind as you were saying this was that I think part of what the CDM was doing was actually the citizen sanction approach that Tom mentioned earlier. So if the people of Burma are basically saying, we want to shut down the economy, then international sanctions that essentially are doing that are essentially following their lead. I think that's part of the equation here. Now, that does not mean that any of us, I think, want to support anything that hurts the general population. We don't. So I think it gets back to your question, your previous question about what can be done on the NUG side of things. And I think it's to get the focus on the arms side of sanctions and flows that are going to the junta potentially, or would normally go. And can you start to resource the other side? It's part of the equation around the NUG is, can they govern? And giving them resources to deliver humanitarian aid, not just align with the PDFs and ethnic armed organizations, but can they actually supply things to the population that will increase their legitimacy, that will give them the practice of governing? That's another part of this, is not just sanctioning, but making sure that resources you might be flowing to the military get moved elsewhere.
Great, thanks, Tyler. Yes, wait, please.
Yeah, so I think just to be clear, when we are talking about sanctions, we are basically talking about targeted sanctions against the military and military businesses and its affiliates, and cutting their revenues, etc. It's not that the general sanctions against the country. So it's the targeted sanctions. And also, as Tyler mentions, people of Myanmar are willing to take risks if it will actually weaken the military's power. And they are already doing it by their own, through many forms of consumer boycotts and targeting military businesses inside Myanmar. So I think that is very powerful. We have never seen that, how people in Myanmar actually has this awareness about awareness about boycotting the military's businesses and trying to understand, do their own research and understand what are the military's business and targeting them specifically in their own way without waiting even international sanctions. So it's so powerful. It's incredible. And I think there are many ways that international community still can target the military without harming the populations, that include sanctioning MOGE, the Myanmar Oil and Gas Enterprise. And also arms embargo, it does not actually affect Myanmar people directly. It will hit the military. Only military will no longer be able to buy sophisticated weaponry that they use against their population, civilians, against its own civilian, and that has to be stopped. The weapons that they are buying is not to fight enemies or other countries, but to use against the innocent civilians. Simply, people are those who are asking for freedom and democracy, and that is so I think unspeakable that they are using this. This heavy artilleries and sophisticated weapons and airstrikes against the civilians, simply asking for wanting to live in free life and in free society, and I think that has to be clear and that has to be stopped.
So let me shift to, this was going to bundle together a number of questions that have come in, which is really based on international activity and what can be done and some of the challenges that are there. I think, as Tom mentioned, news comes and goes, particularly here in the US, and we have a lot of different flashpoints going on right now, whether it's Ukraine or Syria or previously Afghanistan, and sometimes Myanmar gets drops below the headlines in all of that, and perhaps lack of attention on it. There also seems to be what seems to be a kind of tacit agreement, in a sense, that to let ASEAN kind of take the lead here in dealing with this. And so one question is that a viable or even the right strategy to take here? The second is a number of questions that are related to what's happening right now at the ICJ, the International Court of Justice, and meeting with members of the junta, and whether that that providing some kind of legitimacy. And so if anybody would have any comments on that as well, that would be much appreciated. So maybe I'll just start with that and see if any of you have a response to those questions.
Can I?
Yeah, please.
Yeah, I mean, I'll just be quick. We have seen all of these debates around the NUG recognitions by the court, and generally speaking, I think for us, we support NUG's recognitions over junta in every platform, and specifically by the states, as the recognitions of the governments come through government to government. And in the case of ICJ, we ideally support the NUG representing the state. So my understanding is that, yes, first, the court does not validate NUG's or junta's representation. My understanding is that, talking to many international lawyers as well, is that the court decision or the representing the case doesn't necessarily validate their legitimacy. And the court also does not decide, and they simply follow their procedures, the way that has to be done. And in this case, they communicate with the embassy in Brussels, which is under control of the military, which follows the military. So that's how they got into it. But overall, I think we do support the NUG's representation. However, one thing that is very, very important for us, for the sake of the victims, genocide victims, and as a case as a whole, I do think, you know, the case should be perceived as a genocide case, and the accountability and justice issue should be at the center of the discussions over the recognition debate. The suffering of the population should not be put aside around this debate. And there are experts and people suggesting the court to delay the decision or the hearing, or recognizing NUG over junta, or different calls. For us, I think we would agree on the court to be transparent or to make the decision public. But the last thing we would want to see is delaying the case. The Rohingya has suffered enough. The people of Burma has suffered enough. How long can we delay? 1 year, 2 years, 10 years until we have a government recognized? I think it will be utterly unfair and immoral to ask the court to delay the case for the victims, genocide victims, and regardless, as I said, we would support the court transparency and making the decision public. And also, we definitely, I talked to many Rohingya in Rakhine as well as in Bangladesh, community leaders, young people, women. Well, we don't want to delay the case at all. They need the accountability. I think accountability and justice should be a center of the movement, and it has to proceed, and that we cannot delay the case. Second, we don't want to undermine the ongoing suffering of the people. It's their life, it's their suffering, and even 1 minute, 1 second is too long for them. And the center of the discussions around this hearing should be about the people, should not be about the recognition. I'm not undermining the importance of it. However, I am so afraid that the discussions around justice and accountability will become second, and the first discussions will end up having with the recognitions. So I think that's my thought. And anybody or any organization, putting forward, bringing this up in a wrong way, are harming the victims and survivors.
And Matt, I think perhaps you can address the ASEAN question. If you wouldn't mind if I threw in, just because some of the other questions were also asking for a little bit of elaboration on the role of particularly China and Russia in this equation as well. And if you might just say, since you brought that up in your comments as well, maybe you could elaborate just a little bit. Thanks.
Yeah, sure. Happy to do that. I think from our perspective, ASEAN has never been able or willing to exercise its responsibility to respond to mass atrocity crimes. And so I think it would be a mistake to be relying on ASEAN to take the lead. However, ASEAN, there are some indications that ASEAN is doing the right thing, not welcoming the Myanmar junta to the meeting of foreign ministers, for example. But I think one illustration of why it's problematic for governments or the UN Security Council, for one, to rely on ASEAN's lead in this situation, when the foreign ministers of ASEAN canceled the meeting because there was some disagreement about whether or not the junta would be represented, and they canceled the meeting. Because they canceled the meeting, the UN Security Council was not going to meet on the situation in Myanmar because the UN Security Council does not want to be seen as overstepping ASEAN. Never mind the fact that the UN Security Council's mandate is to protect international peace and security. And when there are threats to international peace and security, that should be the bar for whether or not they meet. Thankfully, there was an outpouring of correspondence. Our understanding is there was an outpouring of correspondence last month to the Security Council, encouraging two member states, encouraging them to meet, regardless of the fact that ASEAN was not meeting about this situation. And thankfully, the Security Council did meet. Of course, the Security Council did not do everything that we all hoped they would have done, namely pass a resolution that would impose a global arms embargo. And that, I think, James, gets to the second question there with regard to China and Russia's complicity. It's very well known that China and Russia there are a number of issues that are simply conversation stoppers when it comes to dealing with this situation in Myanmar. And both of these, we very much look forward actually to the special report that the special rapporteur will be releasing soon that you mentioned earlier, Tom, on the arms trade, because China and Russia are primary arms dealers to the Myanmar military. And so that, from our perspective, is certainly an indicator of complicity in mass atrocity crimes that are taking place there.
Thanks, Matt. That helped. That's very helpful. We only have a very short amount of time left. We may go over just a little bit here, just a few minutes, if that's okay with everybody. But I would kind of like to turn towards a final, just perhaps thinking in a positive direction here, possibly in the face of I know what is very dire news coming out of Myanmar. But I think this came up mostly in Tyler's comments as well, is that once we've seen this descent into a much more violent kind of encounter over the past year, we now are in a situation where even civil disobedience, I think we are well aware that tends to be much more successful when it remains nonviolent as well. So how for both sides here, is there what is going to be the best way or possibility going forward to return to a more peaceful engagement in Myanmar, to bring some kind of get away from the real kind of violence that has increased so dramatically over this past year? I mean, initially, that was when we met last year, we were asking these types of questions about what to do now and what should the opposition be doing. And I think at that time, things were still primarily at a fairly peaceful level in terms of protest and engagement. So I'm just curious if you have any practical or just some suggestions about how this might be dealt with at this point, because it's become such a dire state in Myanmar. Any of you?
Well, James, the National Unity Government made it very clear when it announced its defensive war that it was doing so precisely because of the failure of the international community to come to the aid of the people of Myanmar. And they said, look, we then have to protect our families, protect our villages, and we're going to launch this defensive war. I think the extent to which the international community focuses on what's going on in Myanmar and takes specific action along the lines that we've just been talking about, the arms embargo, sanctions, diplomatic isolation. There are a range of options at our disposal, but we lack sufficient political will. And you mentioned ASEAN. Let me just say, floating around this international community as I have been as the special rapporteur, I hear so often people pointing somewhere else as to where responsibility lies. Well, we have to wait for ASEAN. Well, we have to wait for the Security Council. Well, we have to wait for this and that. No one is willing to take responsibility. And I think that is the key. There is something that everyone can do, including the United States. Now that we're having this discussion in the United States. And I think that people who are watching this or engaged in or thinking about this can themselves engage. In the case of the United States, engaging with members of Congress, tell them that this is extremely important. Say that we want to see the United States take stronger, more focused action, take leadership in organizing and coordinating countries to work together if the Security Council isn't going to act. All of these are options that are at our disposal, but what we lack is the political will, and that's where all of us come in.
Any other fine? Tyler, would you like to, yeah, please go, Tyler, and then we'll draw to a close after that, unless Weiwei or Matt have another short comment. But go ahead, Tyler.
Well, I think that the list of things, from the arms embargo, the sanctions approach, the taking money away, that's about getting the junta to the table. They're not going to come to the table willingly. And the other part of the equation is, when they come to the table, is the international community really going to be there to facilitate? And have they kept up with supporting the resistance groups and the CDM that's evolved into armed conflict, and the NUG, so that when people are at the table, then we get serious negotiations? And so that right now, the recipe is not there. But I think everybody's been laying out, here's the recipe to get the military to the table. China's not going to come out publicly and do that. It's going to be behind the scenes. But they will listen. ASEAN's going to be mixed. But if enough of the international community signals with those sanctions, they'll listen, and then they'll be at the table, and then you can let's get back to de-escalation.
Thanks, Tyler. Weiwei or Matt, do you have any final comments?
Yeah, just one thing around the expectation from the international community, the expectations and goal from the international community and the people in Myanmar. And I think we cannot just look into the situation just as or aim or have a goal for a compromise and a negotiation table. I mean, I just want to add on what Tyler has already mentioned. At some point, there will be some sort of negotiations or compromise. But the junta has already shown that they are not willing to come to the negotiation table or step down easily, by showing their cruelty and also not actually implementing the 5-point consensus that they have actually come with the ASEANs. So it is quite clear that they're not willing or easy to come to the table to negotiate or to compromise at all. But the sanctions, arms embargo, and all of the diplomatic pressures and other hardcore pressures may lead to the negotiations at some point. However, we also have to understand dynamic on the ground. Yes, some politicians or majority, perhaps many, I guess the political side of the movement may want to see some sort of negotiations happen, and then thus they will regain the power. However, the vast majority of the public and people in the movement, including young people, they would be very cautious about what types of negotiations we are talking about. What are we going to get out of it? That would be one very difficult and important question that international community may not understand. And second, the majority of the people, public in Myanmar, are not just talking about negotiations, or they're not actually talking about negotiations at all. They're actually talking about holding the military leaders accountable for their crimes. And I think we have to be able to see this, break down this, and address in a way that address all the demands and asks from the movement as a whole. Otherwise, we won't be able to de-escalate or disarm in on the ground. So I think the expectations and the goals from the international community and the people in general, people and pro-democracy movement, there is a bit of gap, and that has to minimize. And one point around the international coordinated actions, the US and the UK and Canada has coordinated on some sanctions policies recently, and I think they can expand on it. And US has already done it in the past, and they can actually use the similar model to have a broader and larger coordinations on the sanctions and arms embargo and accountability, and relying on the ASEAN will be a wrong approach, another mistake. I have talked about this several times, and I have even wrote in April on Washington Post, and I am right, and many of us are right, and many of you are right, and the US and the international, the like-minded countries cannot just simply rely on the ASEAN to take leadership, to take a lead to address Myanmar problem. ASEAN is now divided once again after the Cambodian leadership, and they are not capable of addressing Myanmar crisis.
Thanks, Wei Wei. I'm very glad that you also mentioned the voice of the youth. We had a very interesting event last Friday of 3 Myanmar poets, very young, incredibly interesting poets who did a panel on poetry against tyranny, and we got to hear some of that in a really interesting way. Matt, did you have a final comment that you would like to make very briefly?
Yeah, I was just, I think someone had raised some questions about PDFs and violations. I think I would just, on that, I would add that, the situation in many of the ethnic states right now constitutes non-international armed conflict. All parties to those conflicts are bound by the Geneva Conventions, by the laws of war, and should be respecting the laws of war. I think moving forward, we haven't yet, but I think we will likely see some of, what's been referred to as whataboutism, where you point out the human rights, the atrocities being perpetrated by the junta, and invariably there will be those voices saying, yeah, well, what about this? As if that were some sort of, rhetorical response to truth-telling about the junta's atrocities. We've seen that in the past. We haven't seen it yet, but it is important in any situation of armed conflict to remind all parties to those conflicts of their human rights obligations. And so, we continue to do that. I know Tom and Wei Wei, Tyler, everybody, all human rights defenders are advocating for the human rights of everybody, and would certainly, I would hope, certainly not refrain from condemning human rights violations that would be perpetrated by parties other than the junta. But certainly the overwhelming violations taking place right now against the people of Myanmar are being perpetrated by the Myanmar military and its henchmen on a national scale. So I just leave it at that. And again, thank you so much, James. Appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks, Matt. Because that was partially, very much what my final question was kind of getting at as well. And I just hope that, first of all, I want to thank you all for taking the time today and for sharing your thoughts on this. And I also hope that we can, I say this not in a mean way, not unfortunately draw on you again, but I hope we're not in this situation. I mean, we need to continue to draw on you for monitoring the situation as it progresses from here. I do hope that it won't take a whole year, but at some point we can reconvene and discuss the future in terms of peace and building of democratic institutions in Myanmar rather than assessing the ongoing problem. But I think in the interim, the best we can do is to keep a spotlight focused on Myanmar and what's happening, and try to share and disseminate as much information that we possibly can. And this is the voice that we have through here for the Asia Center, and but we couldn't do it without you all lending your voice to the conversation, and we very much appreciate that. So thank you for coming today, and also thank you to all of the audience and the excellent questions that we received. I'm sorry we couldn't get to everyone one in detail. I was trying to group things together in ways that I hope made some sense and touched on the spirit, at least, of the question. So thanks again. Be well. Keep up the good work, and we'll be all reading your reports and listening whenever we can to information coming out of Myanmar. So thank you all.